The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in April of 1876, and as Julia Donovan stood on the dusty platform of the Ogden, Utah station, she realized with growing horror that the man holding a weathered hat in his calloused hands could not possibly own the grand estate she had been promised. Frederick Irving stood a respectful distance away, his sun-browned face creased with what looked like equal parts hope and apprehension, and when their eyes met across the small crowd of travelers, Julia felt her carefully constructed dreams begin to crumble like dried adobe in a rainstorm. She had traveled all the way from Philadelphia, carrying 2 heavy trunks filled with silk dresses and fine china that her deceased mother had left her, expecting to arrive at a sprawling ranch house with white pillars and servants' quarters. The letters from Frederick had been sparse on details about his home, but generous in describing his land holdings and cattle operation. And Julia, desperate to escape her aunt's cramped boarding house and the endless parade of lecherous suitors who saw her only as an object to possess, had filled in the blanks with her own hopeful imagination. Now, as Frederick approached with tentative steps, his worn boots kicking up small clouds of dust, Julia forced herself to maintain the composure her mother had drilled into her since childhood. He was handsome enough, she supposed, with clear blue eyes that held an honesty she rarely encountered back east, and shoulders broad enough to suggest he was no stranger to hard work. His sandy hair needed a trim, and his clothes, while clean, had been mended in several places. This was not the prosperous gentleman rancher she had envisioned. Miss Donovan. His voice was deep and carried the slight hesitation of a man unaccustomed to formal speech. "I am Frederick Irving. I hope your journey was not too difficult." Julia swallowed hard, fighting the urge to climb right back onto the train and disappear into the mountains. Instead, she extended her gloved hand, noting how his rough palm dwarfed her own. "Mr. Irving." The journey was long but tolerable. She watched his face carefully as he took in her appearance. Her traveling dress was one of her simpler garments, a deep green wool with only modest bustle and trim. But even so, she could see him calculating the cost of the fabric, the delicate buttons, the matching hat perched on her upswept auburn hair. His expression flickered with something that might have been concern. "I have a wagon waiting," he said, releasing her hand quickly as if afraid he might damage it. "We can load your belongings and head out to the ranch before the afternoon heat sets in." Ranch. The word should have comforted her, but somehow, looking at this earnest cowboy with his patched shirt and careful manners, Julia suspected that ranch might mean something entirely different from what she imagined. The wagon turned out to be a simple buckboard, functional but far from elegant. Frederick handled her trunks with surprising ease, his muscles flexing beneath his shirt as he lifted the heavy cases as though they weighed nothing at all. A younger man, whom Frederick introduced as his ranch hand Tommy, helped secure the luggage with practiced efficiency. "Tommy here helps me with the cattle and horses," Frederick explained as he assisted Julia onto the wagon seat. "He stays in the bunkhouse about a quarter-mile from the main cabin. Cabin. Not house, not manor, but cabin." Julia felt her stomach tighten as she arranged her skirts on the rough wooden seat. The cushion Frederick had provided was thin, and already she could feel every bump in the wood beneath her. As they rolled out of Ogden, heading east toward the Wasatch Mountains, Frederick attempted conversation. "I hope my letters gave you a fair understanding of life out here. It is not Philadelphia, I know, but there is a beauty to this land that grows on a person." Julia gazed at the landscape rolling past. The mountains were indeed impressive, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the spring warmth, and the valley stretched out in shades of green and gold that she had to admit possessed a wild charm. But where were the grand homes? Where were the signs of civilization and prosperity? Your letters mentioned substantial land holdings, Julia said, trying to keep the accusation from her tone. How many acres do you manage? 320, Frederick answered with evident pride. It took me 6 years to earn the money for the filing fees and prove up on the claim. The cattle operation is modest, but growing. Last year I sold 40 head at good prices. 320 acres sounded impressive until Julia did the mathematics in her head. Divided by the 6 years he mentioned, with the costs of cattle and equipment and living expenses, the profit could not be substantial. Her heart sank further. They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon, the plodding of the horses, and the occasional call of a bird. Julia studied Frederick from the corner of her eye. He had a strong profile, and there was something solid and dependable about the way he handled the reins, the way he scanned the horizon as if reading a story written in the land itself. "I should tell you," Frederick said suddenly, his voice careful, "that my home is simple. I built it myself over the course of 2 summers. It has everything necessary for comfortable living, but it is not what you are likely accustomed to. If you find it is not suitable, I will understand, and I will arrange for your return journey without any obligation." The kindness in his offer surprised Julia. Most men of her acquaintance would have considered the marriage contract binding regardless of circumstances, would have demanded she honor the agreement or suffer social consequences. But Frederick spoke as though he genuinely cared about her happiness, or at least her comfort. "That is generous of you," Julia said quietly. She was not sure what else to say. Part of her wanted to demand they turn around immediately, but where would she go? Back to Philadelphia and her aunt's bitter household. She was 22 years old with no prospects, no fortune, and no family willing to support her indefinitely. She had made her choice when she answered Frederick's advertisement, and now she had to see it through, at least long enough to understand what she was facing. The landscape grew more rugged as they climbed into the foothills. Scrub oak and juniper dotted the slopes, and Julia spotted cattle grazing in the distance, their red and white markings bright against the golden grass. Frederick pointed out landmarks as they traveled, his voice warming as he spoke of his land. "That canyon to the north has the best spring water you will ever taste," he said. "And come summer, wildflowers cover these hillsides in colors you would not believe. Purple lupine and red Indian paintbrush and yellow sunflowers tall as a man's chest." Despite her disappointment, Julia found herself listening. There was genuine love in the way Frederick spoke about this rough country, a connection to the land that was foreign to her experience but strangely appealing. When they finally crested a ridge and Frederick pointed down into a small valley, Julia braced herself. "There," he said simply. "Home." The cabin sat in a clearing beside a narrow creek lined with cottonwood trees. It was constructed of logs, chinked with mud and lime, with a stone chimney rising from one end. A small porch fronted the structure, and Julia could see a barn and several outbuildings in various states of repair scattered around the property. The entire dwelling looked as though it might fit into the parlor and dining room of her aunt's Philadelphia townhouse. Julia closed her eyes, willing herself not to cry. This was her future. This tiny cabin in the middle of nowhere, married to a man she had known for less than 2 hours, with none of the comforts or refinements she had taken for granted her entire life. "I know it is not much," Frederick said, and the apology in his voice made Julia open her eyes. He was not looking at the cabin but at her, and his expression held such genuine concern that she felt ashamed of her self-pity. "But it is sturdy and warm. I built the chimney myself, and it draws well. There is a good loft for storage, and the creek never runs dry, even in the hottest summers. He was trying so hard, Julia realized, trying to show her the value in what he had built with his own hands, trying to help her see past the rough exterior to something worth having. She thought about the letters they had exchanged, the careful script in which he had written about his dreams of building something lasting, of having a family, of creating a legacy on this wild land. He had never lied to her, she realized now. She had simply refused to read what was actually on the page, preferring instead her own fantasies. "It looks very well built," Julia managed, and she was rewarded with a flash of relief in Frederick's eyes. As they descended into the valley, a dog emerged from the porch, barking enthusiastically. Frederick whistled sharply, and the animal sat immediately, though its tail continued sweeping the dirt in broad arcs. "That is Scout," Frederick said. "He is mostly well-mannered, but if he bothers you, I can keep him outside." "I like dogs," Julia said, and it was true. Her aunt had never allowed animals in the house, declaring them dirty and uncivilized, but Julia remembered the neighbor's spaniel from her childhood, how it would rest its head on her knee when she felt sad. Frederick's smile at this small piece of information was so genuine that Julia felt something shift in her chest. Perhaps this would not be easy, but perhaps Frederick Irving was a good man. Perhaps that counted for something. The inside of the cabin was a single large room with the loft Frederick had mentioned accessible by a sturdy ladder. A rope bed occupied one corner, covered with what looked like a handmade quilt in a pattern of blues and browns. A table and chairs sat near the stone fireplace, and Julia could see a cast iron stove, shelves for supplies, and pegs on the wall for hanging clothes and equipment. Everything was meticulously clean and organized with a precision that spoke of military training or simply a disciplined mind. "I have been sleeping in the loft," Frederick said, gesturing upward. "The bed is yours. I thought you would want privacy until after we are married proper." Julia turned to him in surprise. "You mean we are not already married?" "The contract I signed binds us to intent," Frederick interrupted gently. "But I thought you would want a ceremony, something to make it real and proper. Reverend Matthews in Ogden can perform the service whenever you are ready. There is no rush." The tears Julia had been fighting finally spilled over. This rough cowboy with his calloused hands and sun-weathered face was showing her more respect and consideration than any of the supposed gentlemen she had known back east. Frederick looked alarmed at her tears, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and offering it with an expression of such distress that Julia almost laughed through her crying. "I apologize," she said, wiping her eyes. "I am not upset. I am just overwhelmed. You have been nothing but kind, and I have been standing here feeling sorry for myself because your home is not a mansion." Frederick's expression shifted to something that might have been hurt, but he quickly masked it. "I never claimed to have a mansion." "If my letters gave that impression, your letters were honest," Julia interrupted. "I was the one who chose not to see clearly. I apologize for my assumptions." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Frederick cleared his throat. "You must be hungry." "I am not much of a cook, but I can manage basic meals. There is salt pork and beans, and I have fresh eggs from the chickens." "I can cook," Julia offered. "My mother taught me before she died. My aunt considered it beneath our station, but I remember the basics." "Then the kitchen is yours," Frederick said, gesturing to the simple setup. "I will bring in your trunks and give you space to settle in." As Frederick carried in her belongings, Julia examined her new domain more closely. The dishes were mismatched but clean, the pots and pans well seasoned and cared for. She found a good supply of staples in the cupboard: flour and sugar and coffee and dried beans, all stored in neat tins to keep out pests. The water bucket by the door was full, and when she dipped a cup in to taste, it was as cold and sweet as Frederick had promised. She began to prepare a simple meal, slicing salt pork and setting it to fry while she worked cornmeal into batter for johnnycakes. The familiar motions soothed her nerves, and by the time Frederick returned from settling the horses, the cabin was filled with the smell of cooking food. "That smells wonderful," Frederick said, and the appreciation in his voice was so genuine that Julia felt a small glow of pride. They ate at the rough table, and Julia found herself studying Frederick as he bent over his plate. He had good manners, she noticed, better than his rough appearance suggested. He did not speak with his mouth full, and he used his napkin appropriately. When he complimented her cooking, it was with simple sincerity rather than flowery flattery. "Where did you learn to build?" Julia asked, genuinely curious. "The cabin is very well constructed." "My father was a carpenter before he died," Frederick said. "He taught me the trade before the war. I served with the Union Army, and after Appomattox, I decided to head west and start fresh. I had seen enough of cities and battlefields to last me a lifetime." "You were in the war." Julia had been only a child during those years, but she remembered the tension, the lists of dead and wounded posted in town squares. 3 years, Frederick said simply. "I do not talk about it much. Those memories are not pleasant." Julia understood. Her own father had died of pneumonia in a Union field hospital in 1863, never even making it to battle. Her mother had followed him to the grave less than a year later, leaving Julia to the care of her mother's sister, a woman whose bitterness had only grown with each passing year. "I am sorry," Julia said softly. "War takes so much from everyone." They finished their meal in companionable silence, and when Julia rose to clear the dishes, Frederick helped without being asked, bringing water from the creek to heat for washing. Julia found herself relaxing slightly. This was not the life she had imagined, but Frederick Irving was proving to be a far better man than she had any right to expect. As the sun began to set, painting the cabin's interior in shades of gold and amber, Frederick showed Julia how to bank the fire in the stove and where he kept the extra blankets. "If you need anything during the night, just call out," he said. "I am a light sleeper." Julia watched as he climbed the ladder to the loft, and for the first time, she noticed how the structure of the cabin had been designed with care and thought. The loft provided privacy while keeping the space unified, and the placement of the windows allowed for cross-ventilation in summer, while the thick log walls would provide insulation in winter. She changed into her nightdress behind a blanket Frederick had strung across the corner for her privacy. And as she slipped between the clean sheets of the surprisingly comfortable bed, Julia realized that while she might have lost her dreams of a mansion, she had gained something potentially more valuable. She had found a man of genuine character, someone who worked hard and lived honestly, someone who treated her with respect and consideration. Sleep did not come easily that first night. The sounds of the wilderness were foreign to her ears. The creek's burble and the wind in the cottonwoods and the distant call of a night bird. But gradually, the sounds became less threatening and more soothing, and Julia drifted off thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, she could build a life here after all. The morning came early in the cabin, with bright sunlight streaming through the eastern window and the sound of Frederick moving quietly in the loft, clearly trying not to wake her. Julia lay still for a moment, orienting herself to this new reality, before rising and dressing quickly in one of her simpler day dresses. Frederick had already started coffee on the stove by the time she emerged from behind the privacy blanket, and he greeted her with a shy smile. "Good morning. I hope the bed was comfortable." "It was, thank you," Julia said, and it was not entirely a lie. The mattress was surprisingly good quality, filled with what felt like fresh straw and soft feathers. "I need to check on the cattle this morning," Frederick said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "You are welcome to come along if you would like to see the ranch, or you can stay here and rest from your journey. Tommy will be working nearby if you need anything." Julia considered. Part of her wanted to stay in the relative comfort of the cabin, but a larger part was curious about this life Frederick had built. "I would like to come," she said, "though I am not sure my dresses are suited for ranch work." Frederick looked thoughtful. "I might have something that would work. Wait here." He disappeared into a trunk in the corner and emerged with a split riding skirt made of sturdy canvas. "This belonged to my sister when she visited 2 years back. She left it here when she went back to Missouri. It might fit you." Julia took the garment, examining it with interest. She had never worn anything like it, but she could see the practicality. "Your sister rides like she was born on horseback," Frederick said with obvious affection. "Margaret has never been one for sitting still. She married a freight hauler and now she drives wagon teams as well as any man." The idea of a woman doing such rough work would have scandalized Julia's aunt, but Julia found herself intrigued. She changed behind the privacy screen, and while the skirt was slightly loose in the waist, it fit well enough. When she emerged, Frederick's approving nod gave her an unexpected rush of pleasure. He saddled 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding for himself and a gentle sorrel mare for Julia. "Copper here is the calmest horse on the ranch," Frederick explained as he helped Julia mount. "She will take good care of you." Julia settled into the saddle, grateful for the riding lessons her father had insisted upon when she was a girl. It had been years since she had ridden, but the skills came back quickly, and soon they were moving at an easy walk across the valley. Frederick pointed out the boundaries of his property as they rode, explaining the rotation he used for grazing and his plans for developing a better water system. Julia found herself genuinely interested, asking questions about the cattle breeds and the challenges of ranching in this climate. "The winters can be brutal," Frederick admitted. 2 years ago, I lost a quarter of my herd to a blizzard that came up sudden and fierce. But you learn to read the signs to prepare better. I built a shelter in that draw over there for the worst weather." They rode to the top of a ridge, and Frederick drew his horse to a stop, gesturing at the vista spread before them. The valley rolled out in shades of green and gold, the mountains rising majestically beyond, and in the distance, Julia could see the glimmer of what might be a larger body of water. "That is part of the Great Salt Lake," Frederick said. "On clear days you can see it from here. This is why I chose this spot. I know the cabin is small, but the land itself, this view, this freedom, it is worth more to me than any mansion could be." Julia looked at the landscape with new eyes. She had spent her whole life in cities, surrounded by buildings and people and the constant noise of civilization. This wild, open space was terrifying in its emptiness, but also breathtaking in its beauty. And Frederick's love for it was evident in every word he spoke, every gesture he made toward the horizon. "It is beautiful," she said quietly, and meant it. They spent the morning checking on the cattle, and Julia watched Frederick work with quiet competence, examining animals, checking fences, making mental notes of repairs that needed doing. He treated his livestock with care and respect, and even Tommy, the young ranch hand who joined them for part of the rounds, clearly admired his employer. "Mr. Irving is the fairest boss I ever had," Tommy told Julia when Frederick was out of earshot, checking a fence line. "He pays on time and does not ask anything of his hands that he would not do himself. Some ranchers treat their workers worse than their cattle, but not Mr. Irving." The simple tribute told Julia more about Frederick's character than any flowery speech could have. A man who was respected by those who worked for him, who was fair and honest in his dealings, was a man of genuine worth. By the time they returned to the cabin, it was past noon, and Julia set about making a meal from the supplies in the pantry. Frederick brought in fresh vegetables from the small garden plot behind the cabin, carrots and early lettuce and new potatoes, and Julia realized he had been providing for himself quite competently before she arrived. "You have done well here," she said, as they ate the simple stew she had prepared. "Building all this from nothing." Frederick looked surprised at the compliment. "I have been fortunate. The land is good and I have worked hard, but a ranch needs a family to truly thrive. That is why I put the advertisement in the paper, why I hope to find someone willing to build this life with me." "Did you have many responses?" Julia asked, curious. "3," Frederick admitted, "but your letter stood out. You wrote about wanting a new start, about being willing to work and learn. You did not ask about money or make demands. You seemed genuine." Julia felt a flash of guilt. She had been genuine in her desire to escape Philadelphia, but she had not been entirely honest about her expectations. "I owe you an apology," she said slowly. "I did want a new start, but I also had unrealistic ideas about what I would find here. I was looking for an easy life, I think. Luxury without having to marry some cruel or boring man back east. And what do you think now?" Frederick asked, his blue eyes steady on her face. Julia considered carefully before answering. "I think I may have found something better than luxury, but I would be lying if I said I was not still frightened of how hard this life seems." "It is hard," Frederick agreed. "There is no denying that. The work is endless, the weather can be harsh, and there are times when I go to bed so exhausted I can barely climb to the loft. But there is satisfaction in it too. In building something that is truly yours, in seeing the results of your labor, in going to sleep knowing you earned your rest honestly." His words resonated with Julia in a way she had not expected. Her life in Philadelphia had been comfortable but ultimately empty, filled with social calls and needlework and endless hours of boredom punctuated by her aunt's bitter complaints. Here, at least, there would be purpose. Over the following days, Julia began to find her place in the routine of ranch life. She took over the cooking entirely, finding satisfaction in producing meals from the simple ingredients available. Frederick proved to be an appreciative audience, and his genuine delight at small improvements, like the sourdough bread she successfully produced on her third attempt, made her efforts feel worthwhile. She also began to explore her surroundings, at first staying close to the cabin but gradually venturing further. The creek became a favorite spot, its banks lined with smooth stones and the water so clear she could see small fish darting among the rocks. She discovered that the cottonwood trees provided blessed shade in the afternoon heat, and she took to bringing her mending there, enjoying the play of light through the leaves. Frederick was unfailingly patient with her questions and her mistakes. When she burned a batch of biscuits, he ate them without complaint. When she accidentally left the chicken coop open and spent an hour chasing down the escaped birds, he helped her round them up with good humor rather than anger. When she asked about the best way to preserve vegetables for winter, he took the time to explain in detail, even though he was clearly exhausted from a long day's work. But it was the evenings Julia found herself looking forward to most. After the supper dishes were washed and put away, Frederick would often sit on the porch, and Julia began joining him there, watching the sun set behind the mountains. At first they sat in silence, but gradually conversations began to flow. Frederick told her about his childhood in Ohio, his 3 sisters and 2 brothers, all scattered now across the country. He spoke of his mother, who had died when he was 16, and his father, who had never recovered from that loss and had drunk himself to death 2 years later. He talked about the war, though only in brief snippets, enough for Julia to understand that he had seen terrible things and carried scars that went deeper than flesh. In turn, Julia found herself opening up about her own past. She told him about her parents, about the happy childhood that had ended so abruptly with her father's death. She spoke of her mother's decline, how the vibrant woman who had taught Julia to read and cook and see beauty in the world had simply faded away after losing her husband. And she told him about her aunt, about the bitter years of living as an unwanted burden, of being paraded before potential suitors like merchandise for sale. "She meant well, I suppose," Julia said one evening about 3 weeks after her arrival. "But she saw me only as a problem to be solved, not as a person with my own thoughts and dreams." "What were your dreams?" Frederick asked softly. Julia considered. "I am not sure I knew. I wanted to be valued, I suppose, to matter to someone, to have a home that was truly mine." She paused, then added with complete honesty, "I thought a grand house would make me happy. I thought wealth and status were what mattered. And now I am beginning to think I was looking for the wrong things." Julia glanced at Frederick, at his profile silhouetted against the dying light. "A mansion is just a building, but a home, that is something different." Frederick turned to look at her, and in his eyes Julia saw something that made her breath catch. It was not just kindness or respect, though both were there. It was something warmer, something that made her heart beat faster. "Julia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the formal miss. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know this life is not what you expected, but I want you to know that having you here, talking with you like this, it means more to me than I can properly express." Julia felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. "It means something to me too," she admitted. "You have shown me more genuine kindness in 3 weeks than I experienced in 3 years in Philadelphia." They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them charged with possibility. Then Frederick stood, offering his hand to help her up. "We should get some rest. Morning comes early." But as his hand clasped hers, strong and warm, Julia felt something shift between them. The formal distance that had characterized their first weeks together was dissolving, replaced by something more real and infinitely more promising. That night, lying in the darkness of the cabin, Julia thought about Frederick sleeping in the loft above her. She thought about his hands, rough from work, but always gentle when they helped her down from her horse or passed her a dish at dinner. She thought about his voice, deep and steady, reading aloud from a book of poems he kept in his trunk. She thought about the way he smiled when he was pleased, how it transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish. She realized with a start, beginning to fall in love with him. The revelation should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with a warm certainty. Frederick Irving might not have a mansion, but he had integrity and kindness and a strength that went far beyond physical capability. He was a good man, an honest man, and the thought of building a life with him no longer felt like a compromise but rather like a gift. The next morning, Julia woke with new determination. She dressed with care, choosing one of her prettier day dresses, and spent extra time arranging her hair. When Frederick climbed down from the loft, she had breakfast waiting and coffee brewed to perfection. "You look lovely this morning," Frederick said, and the admiration in his eyes made Julia glad she had taken the extra effort. "Frederick," she said, setting down her coffee cup with a slight tremor in her hands, "I have been thinking about what you said about the wedding ceremony. If the offer still stands, I would like to speak with Reverend Matthews. I would like to make this official and proper." Frederick's face lit up with such joy that Julia felt her own smile grow in response. "You are certain? I do not want you to feel rushed or pressured." "I am certain," Julia said firmly. "I came here to marry you, and while I may have had foolish expectations about mansions and grand estates, I have discovered something far more valuable. I have found a good man and a life worth building. I would be honored to become your wife." Frederick crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her hands in his. "Julia Donovan, you have made me the happiest man in the Utah Territory." They rode into Ogden the following Saturday, both dressed in their finest clothes. Julia wore a dress of deep blue silk that she had been saving for a special occasion, and Frederick had borrowed a proper suit from Tommy, who despite being younger was almost the same size. They stopped at the small church where Reverend Matthews presided, and the elderly minister greeted them warmly. "I was hoping you would return," Reverend Matthews said to Frederick. "When you told me about your mail-order bride, I hoped it would work out well." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Tommy and his sweetheart Sarah stood as witnesses, and the Reverend's wife played hymns on the small organ in the corner. When Frederick slipped a simple gold band onto Julia's finger, she felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of happiness rather than sorrow. "I promise to honor you and care for you all my days," Frederick said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise to work hard to provide for you and any children we may be blessed with. I promise to listen when you speak and value your thoughts and dreams as much as my own." Julia's own vows came from the heart. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges we face. I promise to be your partner in building our home and our life. I promise to see you clearly, not as I might wish you to be but as you are, and to love you for exactly that." When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Frederick's kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise for the future they would build together. They celebrated with a simple meal at Ogden's small hotel, and Sarah, who proved to be a cheerful young woman with a quick smile, told Julia about the other ranch wives in the area. "We get together once a month for quilting," Sarah explained. "It would be wonderful to have another woman join us. Lord knows we can use the conversation." "I would love that," Julia said honestly. The idea of female companionship, of building friendships in this new place, filled her with hope. The ride back to the ranch felt different than the journey there. Julia was acutely aware of Frederick beside her, of his new right as her husband to share not just his home but his life with her. When they arrived at the cabin, he helped her down from the horse with special care, his hands lingering at her waist. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irving," he said softly, and the name sent a thrill through Julia. The evening took on a dreamlike quality as they moved through their now familiar routines with new awareness of each other. Julia prepared supper while Frederick tended the horses, but every glance across the cabin felt charged with meaning. When Frederick climbed down from the loft with his bedding, ready to claim his rightful place beside his wife, Julia felt nervous but also ready. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, marked by Frederick's careful consideration for Julia's inexperience and her own surprised delight at the intimacy they shared. In the darkness, Frederick held her close and whispered, "I never dared hope I would find someone like you. Someone who could see past the rough exterior to what I am trying to build here." "I was a fool not to see it immediately," Julia murmured against his chest. "You offered me honesty and genuine affection, and I was too busy looking for material wealth to recognize real treasure." As the weeks turned into months, Julia settled fully into her new life. The work was indeed hard, harder than anything she had known in Philadelphia, but it was also deeply satisfying. She learned to tend the vegetable garden, coaxing beans and squash and tomatoes from the Utah soil. She learned to preserve food for winter, filling the cabin's shelves with jars of pickles and jams and canned vegetables. She learned to make soap and candles, to churn butter and render lard, to do the thousand small tasks that kept a ranch household running. Frederick proved to be an attentive and loving husband. He consulted her on decisions about the ranch, genuinely valuing her input even when she felt her knowledge was inadequate. He surprised her with small gifts, a length of pretty calico from town, a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, wildflowers picked on his morning rides. But more than the gifts, it was his steady presence that Julia came to treasure. The way he always made time to talk with her in the evenings, no matter how exhausted he was from the day's work. The way he listened when she spoke, really listened, considering her words carefully before responding. The way he looked at her sometimes, as if he could not quite believe his good fortune in finding her. Summer brought its own challenges and rewards. The heat was intense, but the valley bloomed with the wildflowers Frederick had promised, and Julia spent hours walking among them, gathering bouquets for the cabin. The cattle thrived on the rich grass, and Frederick's herd grew as several cows birthed healthy calves. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Frederick said, "I have been thinking about expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and maybe a room for children when we are blessed with them. What do you think?" Julia considered. The cabin was small, but she had grown fond of it, of its cozy efficiency. But the idea of children filled her with warmth, and they would need more space. "I think that sounds wonderful, though I would hate to lose the simplicity of what you built." "We would keep the main room as it is," Frederick assured her. "Just add onto the side. I could start cutting logs this fall and begin building next spring." "Then I think it is a fine idea," Julia said, leaning into his shoulder. "Though this cabin will always be special to me. It is where I learned what really matters." "And what is that?" Frederick asked, his arm coming around her waist. "That love is not found in the size of a house or the fineness of its furnishings," Julia said softly. "It is found in the character of the person you share it with. In kindness and respect and genuine partnership. You gave me all of that, Frederick. You gave me everything that truly matters." Frederick pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You gave me something too. You took a chance on a rough cowboy with nothing but a small cabin and big dreams. You saw potential where you could have seen only poverty. You gave me hope, Julia, and a future worth working toward." That autumn, Julia discovered she was expecting their first child. The news filled them both with joy tempered by the practical concerns of frontier life. The nearest doctor was in Ogden, a journey of several hours, but Sarah introduced Julia to Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman whose husband had worked on the railroad and who had extensive experience as a midwife. Mrs. Chen examined Julia with gentle competence and declared her healthy and strong. "You do well," she said in careful English. "Baby come in spring. You rest when tired, eat good food, and all will be fine." Frederick became even more protective, insisting Julia avoid heavy work and constantly worrying about her well-being. Julia found his concern endearing even when it became excessive, and she gently but firmly maintained her routines, knowing that staying active and useful would serve her better than idle rest. Winter came early that year, with snow falling in October and temperatures dropping sharply. But the cabin proved as sturdy as Frederick had promised, the thick walls and good chimney keeping them warm even on the coldest nights. They spent the long evenings reading aloud to each other, working on the baby's layette, and planning for the spring expansion. Julia had never been happier. The physical comforts of her Philadelphia life seemed insignificant compared to the emotional richness she had found in Utah. She had a husband who loved and respected her, a home that was truly hers, and a future filled with promise. On a particularly cold December evening, as snow swirled outside and the fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, Julia sat mending while Frederick carved a small wooden horse for their coming child. "Do you ever regret answering my advertisement?" Frederick asked suddenly. Julia looked up in surprise. "Never. Why would you think that?" "I see how hard you work," Frederick said, his knife stilling. "I know this life is nothing like what you knew before, the endless chores, the isolation, the harsh weather. Sometimes I worry that you will wake up one day and realize what you gave up." Julia set down her mending and crossed to where Frederick sat. She took the carving from his hands and set it aside, then took his face between her palms. "Frederick Irving, you listen to me. I gave up nothing of value. I left behind empty social rituals and false friendships and a life that would have slowly suffocated me. What I found here, what you gave me, is real. Our love is real. Our partnership is real. Our life together is real. I would not trade this small cabin and our hard-won happiness for all the mansions in Philadelphia." Frederick's eyes shone with unshed tears. "I love you, Julia Irving, more than I thought it was possible to love another person." "And I love you," Julia said, kissing him softly. "My good, honest, hardworking cowboy, you are worth more than all the wealth in the world." The baby came on a warm April morning, right on schedule according to Mrs. Chen's predictions. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Julia thought she could not endure, but Frederick never left her side, and Mrs. Chen's calm competence saw her safely through. When the baby's first cry filled the cabin, Julia wept with relief and joy. Frederick's face when Mrs. Chen placed their son in his arms was a picture Julia would treasure forever, a mixture of awe and fierce love and overwhelming tenderness. "A boy," Frederick whispered, his voice breaking. "We have a son." They named him James after Julia's father and Daniel after Frederick's. The baby was healthy and strong, with his father's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair that might have come from either parent. Life with an infant was exhausting but joyful. Julia marveled at the tiny person they had created, at his perfect fingers and toes, his serious expressions, his gradually developing smile. Frederick was a devoted father, walking the floor with James when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours simply watching his son sleep. Sarah and the other ranch wives rallied around Julia, bringing meals and advice and welcome adult conversation. Mrs. Chen visited regularly to check on both mother and baby, and her calm presence reassured Julia through the challenges of new motherhood. As summer returned to the valley, Frederick began work on the cabin expansion. With Tommy's help and occasional assistance from neighboring ranchers, the additional rooms began to take shape. Frederick worked with the same careful precision he had brought to the original cabin, ensuring every log was properly fitted, every corner square. By autumn, the addition was complete. A proper bedroom for Julia and Frederick, larger than the original sleeping area, with 2 real windows that let in morning light. And a smaller room, perfect for James and any future children, with shelves Frederick had built for toys and books. The night they moved into the new bedroom, Julia stood at the window looking out at the valley she had come to love. Frederick came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. Julia leaned back into his embrace, thinking about the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the frightened, disappointed woman who had stepped off the train in Ogden nearly 2 years ago, clutching her trunks full of silk dresses and unrealistic expectations. She thought about how much she had changed, how much she had grown, how this rough land and this good man had transformed her understanding of what mattered. "I am more than happy," she said, turning in Frederick's arms to face him. "I am content. I am fulfilled. I am exactly where I am meant to be." "Even though there is no mansion," Frederick teased gently, though his eyes were serious. "Especially because there is no mansion," Julia said firmly. "This cabin, with its additions built by your hands, filled with the furniture you crafted and the memories we have made together, is worth more than any grand estate. Because it was built with love, Frederick. Every log, every board, every nail was placed with care and purpose and hope for our future. That makes it more valuable than all the mansions in the world." The years that followed were marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growing of their family. 2 years after James, Julia gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Frederick's adventurous sister. 2 years after that came another son, Thomas. And then, when Julia thought they might be done, a surprise daughter they named Rose arrived, completing their family at 4 children. The cabin expanded again to accommodate their growing brood, with Frederick adding a second story that gave the older children their own space. The ranch prospered as well, Frederick's careful management and hard work paying off in steady growth. They would never be wealthy by Philadelphia standards, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Julia became a pillar of the small community that grew up in the area. She helped organize a school for the ranch children, teaching reading and arithmetic 3 days a week in a small building the families built together. She mentored younger brides who came west, sharing the hard-won knowledge she had gained about frontier life. She became known for her preserves and her sourdough bread, which she often shared with neighbors. Frederick's reputation grew as well. He was known as a fair dealer, an honest businessman, and a good neighbor. When troubles came, whether drought or disease or difficult calving season, other ranchers sought his advice. He served on the territorial council for a time, representing the interests of small ranchers. But it was their partnership, the deep and abiding love they shared, that became legendary in its own quiet way. People spoke of how Frederick and Julia worked together in perfect harmony, how they clearly valued each other's opinions, how even after years of marriage they could still be seen holding hands or sharing private jokes. One evening, when Julia was 45 and Frederick 48, they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their children were grown now, James working the ranch alongside his father, Margaret married to a good man and living in Ogden with her own growing family, Thomas studying to be a veterinarian in Salt Lake City, and Rose teaching at the school Julia had helped establish. "Do you remember the first time we sat here together?" Frederick asked, his hand finding Julia's as naturally as breathing. "I remember everything about those early days," Julia said. "How disappointed I was when I first saw the cabin, how afraid I was that I had made a terrible mistake. And now," Julia looked at the cabin, expanded and improved but still fundamentally the same structure Frederick had built with his own hands all those years ago. She looked at the barn and outbuildings, the corrals holding their cattle and horses, the garden plot that had grown to feed their large family. She looked at the valley spread before them, the land they had worked and loved for more than 2 decades. "Now I know it was the best decision I ever made," she said. "Coming here, marrying you, building this life. I thought I wanted a mansion, Frederick. I thought material comfort was what mattered, but you showed me something far more valuable. You showed me that a small cabin built with honest labor and filled with genuine love holds more than any mansion ever could." Frederick raised their clasped hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "You made all my dreams come true, Julia. Every single one. This ranch, our children, the life we have built together. I am the luckiest man who ever lived." "We are both lucky," Julia said softly. "We found each other across the miles, two people who needed exactly what the other had to offer. You needed someone to share your dream of building something lasting. I needed someone to show me what really matters." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, they sat together in comfortable silence. Two people who had built a life of meaning and purpose on the Utah frontier. The cabin behind them might have been small compared to the grand estates of the East, but it held something those mansions could never contain. It held love freely given and faithfully kept, dreams pursued and realized, a family raised with care and purpose, and a partnership that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger. Julia thought about the letters she sometimes received from old acquaintances in Philadelphia, full of news about society events and grand homes and elaborate celebrations. She thought about her aunt, who had died several years back without ever understanding why Julia had chosen such a rough life. She thought about all the things she had left behind when she stepped onto that train so many years ago, and she regretted nothing, because Frederick had been right all along. The land itself, the freedom of this wild place, the satisfaction of building something with your own hands, the deep contentment of a life lived with purpose and shared with someone you loved truly and completely. These things were worth more than any mansion, any fortune, any social position. The cowboy's small cabin had indeed held more love than Julia had ever imagined possible. And in that love, she had found everything she had been searching for without knowing what she sought. She had found home, not in the grandness of a building but in the goodness of a man and the life they had built together. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, Frederick and Julia rose to go inside, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, as every day did on a working ranch. But they would face it together, as they had faced everything for more than 20 years, partners in the truest sense of the word. And that, Julia reflected as they stepped into the warm glow of their cabin, their children's laughter drifting down from upstairs where James had stopped by for supper with news about the new foals, was the greatest treasure of all. Not gold or silver or fine mansions, but love honestly earned and faithfully kept, a family raised with care, a life built with purpose. The small cabin, with all its additions and improvements, stood solid and true against the Utah night, a testament to what two people could build when they chose love over luxury, partnership over pretense, and genuine connection over empty grandeur. And within its log walls, the Irving family continued to write their story, a story that had begun with a mail-order bride's disappointed expectations and a cowboy's humble offering, but had become something far richer and more beautiful than either could have imagined. Julia fell asleep that night in Frederick's arms, as she had for more than 2 decades, grateful beyond measure for the twist of fate that had brought her to this place, to this man, to this life. She had expected a mansion and found instead something infinitely more valuable. She had found love in its truest form, and she had discovered that a small cabin built with honest hands and filled with genuine affection was indeed the greatest mansion of all. Their legacy would live on through their children and grandchildren, through the ranch that James would continue to build and improve, through Margaret's teachings to her own children about the value of honest work and genuine love, through Thomas's dedication to healing and helping, through Rose's commitment to education and community. But more than that, their legacy would live on in the example they set, of two people who chose each other daily, who worked together through every challenge, who built something lasting not through wealth or status, but through dedication and partnership and abiding love. And sometimes, on quiet evenings decades later, their grandchildren would sit on that same porch and listen to stories about the bride who came from Philadelphia expecting a mansion, and the cowboy who offered only a small cabin but gave her the world. They would hear about disappointment transformed into joy, about expectations shattered and rebuilt into something better, about the discovery that love was not found in the grandness of surroundings, but in the goodness of the person you shared them with. The small cabin in the Utah Valley, expanded and improved but never losing its essential character, stood as a monument to a simple truth: that the measure of a home is not found in its size or splendor, but in the love that fills it and the lives that are lived within its walls. Frederick and Julia Irving had proven that truth with every day of their marriage, and their story became a reminder that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as disappointments, and our truest treasures are found in the places we least expect. As the seasons continued their eternal cycle, spring following winter, following fall, following summer, the Irving Ranch thrived under the care of each new generation, but the heart of it remained the same. That small cabin where a disappointed bride and an honest cowboy had discovered that love was indeed the greatest mansion of all.